Why would they kill her? I don't care what happens to people. I really don't, because they have to live with it. But I want to know why they killed my daughter.
The call came in at 4:21 p.m. When police arrived at the Lincoln Village apartment complex in Columbus, Ohio. They found a scene that would haunt them for decades. Inside, lying on the hardwood floor, was the body of 20-year-old Amy Hooper. She was naked, her hands bound behind her with a distinctive necklace, her skull cracked open, and her body riddled with stab wounds. But it wasn't just the brutality of the crime that disturbed investigators. It was the eerie precision of it all. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. For 32 years, 9 months, and 8 days, her killer walked free. The case went cold, but it never went away. Detectives who worked the case would see her face every day, walking into work, a constant reminder of justice delayed. Her father died in 2009, never knowing who took his daughter's life, carrying that burden of uncertainty to his grave. But on December 5th, 2023, everything changed. A discarded item, a DNA test, and suddenly, the shadows that had hidden Amy's killer for over 3 decades began to recede. The question was no longer who killed Amy Hooper, but why? What drove someone to commit such a savage act against a young woman known for her kindness, who had recently helped a homeless mother and child by giving them a place to stay? The answer would reveal a twisted tale of obsession, betrayal, and a killer who thought they had gotten away with murder. This is the story of how a decades-old cold case was finally cracked and how justice, though delayed, was not denied. But first, we need to go back to where it all began to understand who Amy Hooper was and why someone would want her dead.
Never a day goes by when I don't think about it. Every day, just think about it.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Amy Joy Hooper was born on November 2nd, 1971, the youngest of 3 daughters. From the start, she was doted on by her older sisters, Holly and Sandy, who treated her like their own little doll. But growing up in Columbus, Ohio, Amy's path wouldn't be as smooth as her early years might have suggested. By her teenage years, the first signs of trouble appeared. Amy began dating a boy her parents disapproved of. And with good reason. He turned out to be abusive, hitting her on 2 separate occasions. The situation grew worse when the boy's mother, who worked in the school cafeteria, began harassing Amy after she tried to break things off. It was Amy's first brush with the kind of obsessive behavior that would later play a deadly role in her life. Concerned for their daughter's safety, Amy's parents gave her a choice. She could either live with her aunt or move to California with her sister Sandy. Amy chose California, a decision that might have saved her life at the time. She spent her junior year of high school there, forming an even closer bond with her sister. But after graduation in 1989, the pull of home brought her back to Columbus. Back in Ohio, Amy moved in with her mother, who was going through a divorce from Amy's father. Despite the family turmoil, Amy had dreams. She wanted to work in fashion and eventually return to California for college. Taking a job as a manager at Wilson's Leather in Westland Mall, she began saving money for her future. She was responsible, never missing a day of work, never showing up late. She even occasionally designed display windows for the Lazarus department store. By early 1992, Amy was ready for independence. On February 17th, she rented her own apartment at 4942 Medfield Way in Lincoln Village. The ground floor apartment opened directly onto a grassy area with walkways leading between various buildings. There were no security gates, no cameras, just a simple door separating Amy from the outside world. In a move that spoke volumes about her character, Amy invited a homeless woman and her child to live with her rent-free. She didn't know the woman well, but Amy had a soft spot for anyone in need. Her mother had initially objected when Amy tried to move them into her house, but Amy was determined to help. This generosity, this willingness to trust, was both her greatest strength and potentially her greatest vulnerability. At just 20 years old and barely 5'3", Amy was described by her family as 90 pounds soaking wet. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination. She was known for dating who she wanted, despite what others might think, and standing her ground when necessary. She loved animals, taking in 2 cats, and had a wide circle of friends. To the outside world, she seemed to be thriving, a young woman building her own life, step by step. But beneath this seemingly normal surface, dark currents were stirring. In the weeks before her death, Amy had confided in her sister Sandy about a man who wouldn't leave her alone. She'd also recently shared concerns with her mother about suspicious activities at work. These seemingly unrelated threads would soon weave together into a deadly pattern, one that would end with Amy's brutal murder. Monday, March 9th, 1992, began like any other day. Amy had just returned from spending the weekend visiting a boyfriend in Bowling Green, a detail she'd kept from her mother. That morning at 6:30 a.m., she arrived at her mother's house in Grove City to return a borrowed car. As her mother, Joy, got ready for work, the two chatted casually. Amy mentioned she had a manager's meeting at work later that day. She seemed happy, normal. There was no indication that these would be their final moments together. After leaving her mother's house with her sister Holly's car, Amy presumably drove straight to her apartment. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation. Police believe Amy took a shower upon returning home, a detail that would later help narrow down their timeline. Her makeup and hairbrushes were found laid out, suggesting she was preparing for work. Her hairdryer was still plugged in, her electric blanket still warm. By 1 p.m., something was clearly wrong. Amy's friends and coworkers began calling each other, trying to locate her. She had missed the manager's meeting, completely out of character for someone who had never missed a day of work in 6 months. Her sister Holly, who was supposed to meet Amy on her lunch break to retrieve her car, called the apartment repeatedly. No answer. Growing increasingly concerned, Holly called their father, Hollis, who drove her to Amy's apartment. They found Holly's car still parked outside. Using her spare key, Holly retrieved her vehicle, assuming there had been some kind of mix-up. But the knot in her stomach wouldn't go away. By 3:30 p.m., the situation had grown dire. Joy, Amy's mother, was at the school where she taught when she began receiving calls from Amy's workplace. As Amy's emergency contact, they wanted to know why she hadn't shown up for her shift. Joy immediately called Holly, who shared her failed attempts to reach Amy throughout the day. A mother's intuition kicked in. Joy knew something was terribly wrong. She asked Holly to meet her at Amy's apartment, and they called Hollis to join them. When they arrived, they found the door locked. With growing dread, they went to the superintendent's office, requesting access to Amy's apartment. Around 4 p.m., Hollis and the superintendent entered the apartment while Joy and Holly waited outside, a decision that would spare them from witnessing the horror within. What they found inside would launch a 3-decade hunt for a killer. There, on the hardwood floor of an upstairs room, lay Amy. She was naked, her hands loosely bound behind her back with a distinctive medallion necklace. Her skull had been cracked open, with what investigators would describe as a sharp, heavy object. The killer hadn't stopped there. Amy had been stabbed multiple times in the neck and heart, with investigators later revealing there were 13 or 14 stab wounds in total. At 4:21 p.m., the 911 call went out. But even as first responders rushed to the scene, it was clear that Amy had been dead for several hours. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department quickly sealed off the area, beginning an investigation that would span more than 3 decades and end with a breakthrough that no one saw coming. As investigators processed the scene, several details immediately stood out. Despite the brutality of the crime, there were no signs of forced entry. The apartment door and windows were intact, suggesting Amy either knew her killer or had willingly opened the door. The only sign of struggle was a phone cord ripped from the wall, a detail that would later paint a haunting picture of Amy's final moments. Deputy Sheriff Chris Floyd, the first officer on scene, noted something disturbing about Amy's body position. "She was displayed," he would later report. "It wasn't as if she fell that way. My first thought was, this was to make a statement. The killer had taken time to position her body, suggesting this wasn't just a murder. It was a message. The murder weapons told their own story. The knife used for the stab wounds was found at the scene, but curiously, the object used to crack Amy's skull, described as a sharp, heavy object, was never recovered. Despite an extensive search of nearby alleys and dumpsters, this crucial piece of evidence remained elusive. Perhaps the most puzzling element was the medallion used to bind Amy's hands. Initial media reports fixated on its distinctive appearance, a wooden and leather piece painted with red, yellow, and green colors, heart-shaped and attached to a black wooden circle. Some speculated it was a message, possibly related to Amy's dating preferences. However, this theory would prove to be a red herring. Amy's sister Sandy later revealed she had purchased the medallion for Amy at a reggae festival in San Diego. What seemed like a crucial clue was simply something convenient the killer had found in Amy's apartment. The timing of the murder presented another mystery. Investigators knew Amy was alive at 6:30 a.m. when she visited her mother. They also knew she had taken a shower after returning home. The medical examiner would place her time of death several hours before her body was discovered at 4 p.m., suggesting the killer struck during a narrow window that morning. But the investigation was about to take an even darker turn. In the weeks following Amy's murder, several women on Columbus's west side reported receiving chilling phone calls. "Remember Amy Hooper?" the male caller would say. "You're going to end up just like that." These calls suggested either the killer was still active in the area or someone was using Amy's death to terrorize others. The evidence painted a picture of a crime driven by rage. The post-mortem stab wounds, the positioning of the body, the excessive violence, all pointed to someone who harbored deep anger toward Amy. Detective Clark, who would spend years on the case, stated firmly that whoever did this to Amy was harboring some kind of rage against her.
We know that this individual is very hardcore.
What made the case particularly frustrating was the presence of significant DNA evidence. Investigators found DNA at the scene that didn't belong to Amy, and they were confident it belonged to the killer. Over the years, this DNA would be used to clear several suspects, including Amy's ex-boyfriends and other persons of interest. But for decades, no match would be found in any database. The brutality of the crime suggested someone who knew Amy, but the lack of forced entry and the timing indicated someone who might have been watching her movements. Was this a crime of passion by someone she knew, or had a predator been stalking her, learning her routine? As investigators dug deeper into Amy's life, a complex web of potential suspects emerged. Each seemed to have a possible motive, yet none could be definitively linked to the crime, at least not initially. The first obvious suspect was Amy's abusive high school boyfriend, the one whose behavior had prompted her temporary move to California. Though their relationship had ended years earlier, his violent past and apparent obsession with Amy put him high on investigators' list. What made him particularly interesting was the revelation that he had allegedly attempted to follow Amy to California after she fled Columbus. However, DNA testing would eventually clear him, forcing investigators to look elsewhere. Then there was Amy's more recent boyfriend, the Bowling Green State University football player she'd spent the weekend with before her death. The diamond ring found on Amy's hand had been his gift to her that very weekend. But his alibi was solid. He was in classes over 2 hours away when the murder occurred. Like the previous boyfriend, DNA testing would eventually eliminate him as a suspect. A more troubling lead emerged from Amy's workplace. In the weeks before her death, Amy had confided in her mother about a disturbing situation at the leather store. She'd discovered that some colleagues were either stealing from the store or planning to do so, and they wanted her cooperation, or at least her silence. Amy had been adamant about not participating, and a manager's meeting was scheduled for the day she was killed. Was this just coincidence, or had someone silenced her to protect their criminal enterprise? But perhaps the most controversial suspect was one whose name was never publicly released. In the weeks before her death, Amy had complained to her sister Sandy about a young man who wouldn't leave her alone. This wasn't just casual pursuit. Amy described his behavior as harassment. When Sandy suggested filing a complaint, Amy's response was telling. She couldn't because he was connected. Specifically, he was the son of the Columbus police chief at the time. This lead was particularly challenging to investigate. While the Franklin County Sheriff's Department handled the case, not the Columbus police, the political sensitivity of the situation was undeniable. To this day, some questions remain about whether this angle was fully investigated. Then there was Amy's roommate, whose sudden departure to Florida the night before the murder raised eyebrows. While she passed a polygraph test and was officially cleared as a suspect, Amy's family remained suspicious. Not necessarily that she was the killer, but that she might know more than she revealed. Had she inadvertently exposed Amy to someone dangerous? Was her timely departure truly just coincidence? The timing and nature of the crime suggested someone familiar with Amy's routine. The killer knew she would be alone that morning. They either knew she would open the door or they were already inside waiting. This pointed to someone who had been watching her, learning her patterns. Detective Clark would later tell reporters that Amy didn't use drugs and didn't run her mouth. She wasn't causing anyone any trouble. Yet someone had harbored enough rage to not just kill her, but to continue attacking her even after death. The overkill suggested a personal connection, but was it possible they were looking at this wrong? Could this have been the work of a predator who had simply zeroed in on a vulnerable target? As leads went cold and suspects were cleared one by one, investigators were left with troubling questions. They had DNA evidence, but no match. They had theories, but no proof. And somewhere, a killer walked free, perhaps still in the Columbus area, perhaps watching as the investigation slowly ground to a halt. For 32 years, Amy Hooper's murder seemed destined to remain one of Columbus's most notorious cold cases. But in 2023, everything changed. The breakthrough that Amy's family had waited over 3 decades for finally came, proving that while justice may be delayed, it isn't always denied. On December 5th, 2023, law enforcement officers arrested Bruce Daniels in Washington state. The arrest didn't come from a confession, a witness coming forward, or a lucky break. It came from the relentless march of scientific progress, the same DNA evidence that had helped clear other suspects over the years finally found its match. The breakthrough began earlier in 2023 when Ohio, BCI, and Franklin County Sheriff's detectives developed Daniels as a person of interest. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. Working with law enforcement in Washington, investigators retrieved an item Daniels had discarded. This seemingly mundane piece of evidence would prove to be the key to cracking the case. When the DNA from this discarded item was tested against evidence recovered from Amy's body 3 decades earlier, investigators finally had what they'd been waiting for: a match. The evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1992 had finally served its purpose. A Franklin County grand jury indicted Daniels on charges of murder and rape. He was booked into the Thurston County Corrections Facility, south of Seattle, awaiting extradition to face justice in Ohio. His arrest hearing was set for January 8, 2024, more than 11,700 days after Amy's murder. The significance of this breakthrough cannot be overstated. For years, detectives had looked at Amy's photo every day as they walked into work, a constant reminder of unfinished business. They had promised her family they wouldn't give up, and despite the decades that passed, they kept that promise. But this isn't just a story about persistence. It's a warning to others who think they've gotten away with murder. Advances in DNA technology, particularly genetic genealogy, have revolutionized cold case investigations. Evidence that might have been useless decades ago can now point directly to a killer, no matter how many years have passed. Sadly, Amy's father didn't live to see this day. He passed away in 2009, still haunting the words he spoke to reporters 1 year after his daughter's death.
Why would they kill her? I don't care what happens to people. I really don't, because they have to live with it. But I want to know why they killed my daughter.
Now, after more than 3 decades, his family might finally get those answers. Amy Hooper's case stands as a testament to the power of persistence and advancing technology. A young woman with dreams of working in fashion who opened her home to those in need had her life brutally cut short at just 20 years old. For over 3 decades, her killer walked free, perhaps thinking they had gotten away with murder. But science, combined with determined investigators who never gave up, finally caught up. The arrest of Bruce Daniels brings hope not just to Amy's family, but to countless others waiting for justice in their own cold cases. It sends a chilling message to those who think time will protect them from their crimes. DNA doesn't forget, and evidence doesn't grow old. The truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing. As this case moves toward prosecution, many questions remain. What was the connection between Amy and her alleged killer? What drove someone to commit such a brutal act against a young woman known for her kindness? And perhaps most importantly, will Amy's family finally get the answers they've waited so long to hear? If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe for more true crime cases. Was there something about this case that stood out to you? Did you live in Columbus during this time? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that no case is truly cold as long as someone remembers